Welcome to State of the State, the monthly roundup of policy and research for the state of Michigan, brought to you by the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University and our friends here at MSU Radio Studios. I'm Arnold Weinfeld, Associate Director for the Institute, and I'm joined by Institute Director Dr. Mac Grossman and economist Dr. Charlie Ballard. Later on, our guest will be Dr. Jason Miller. Dr. Miller is a professor of supply chain management at Michigan State University and is serving the second year of a 2-year term as interim chairperson for the Department of Supply Chain Management at MSU's Eli Broad College of Business. An expert on supply chains, he conducts macroeconomic research in the manufacturing and retail sectors with a special emphasis on the disruptive role of imports and tariffs. So you can only imagine what we'll be talking about with Dr. Miller. But before that, let's get started with discussion on some of the latest economic and political news from the country and across Michigan. And Charlie, I can't help but start with you and ask for your perspective on the numbers from yesterday, which showed a shrinking economy.
Yes, yesterday, Wednesday, the Commerce Department released its preliminary estimates for the gross domestic product for the first quarter of this year. And that's the total value of all the goods and services that are produced in the United States. And as you said, it was a drop. First time in 3 years that gross domestic product has fallen by 0.3%. So that's not a precipitous decline, but it's interesting to unpack the numbers. Consumers increased their spending, although at a slower rate than they have been for the last few years. So people are still buying stuff, but they retrenched a little bit, didn't increase their spending as much. And that's interpreted by most economists to be the result of just the general uncertainty that has been injected in the economy in the last few months with the on-again, off-again tariffs and all that. Which I think we'll be talking about a lot more. But the other thing is, of the stuff that American consumers spent money on, the fraction of it that was produced in the United States went down because there was a surge in imports, and that's almost certainly because companies are in the first quarter, we're trying to get goods and services into the United States before the tariffs take effect. So you put those pieces together with all the other things that go into gross domestic product, and there was a slight decline, the first fall in GDP in 3 years. I also want to just mention briefly how the Michigan economy is doing. And here I'm going to talk not about GDP, but about employment, which is something that a lot of people worry about. Employment has been increasing in Michigan over the last couple of years. Since we came out of COVID, we've had a slow but more or less steady in the number of people who are working. Interestingly, though, we've had an even bigger increase in the number of people who are looking for work. So there's been an increase in labor force participation, and that has been enough that there haven't been enough new jobs to fill up all the people who are looking for work. That's why our unemployment rate keeps ticking up. And last month, our unemployment rate in Michigan reached 5.5%. It was 4.2% a year ago. It was 3.8% 2 years ago. The unemployment rate in the United States as a whole has edged up, but not nearly as much as in Michigan. So it's a mix of news, but overall not a super happy. Certainly we're not seeing gangbusters growth in Michigan, and the U.S. economy actually shrank in the last quarter.
So Matt, it's your turn to shed the political light on all this. The president quite quickly announced that this was all Biden's issue. He's only been in office 100 days, and he's trying to fix things from a sour economy and has asked for patience. That spin going to work?
Perhaps surprisingly, it has usually worked historically. That is, the first year of a new president's economy does typically get blamed on the predecessor or credited to the predecessor in terms of its relationship with election outcomes or the president's standing. But Trump likes to be in the spotlight, and it's going to be a lot easier for voters to connect any economic downturn with his policies because the press has been very clear about the trade war being responsible for the potential economic downturn and the economic disruption and the declines in the markets. So it's going to be harder for him to do that than previous presidents have been able to do. But it has worked in the past that voters do give presidents a bit of a honeymoon. Now, President Trump's approval ratings are going down as fast or faster than previous presidents, and they started at a lower level than for most presidents, though higher than in his first term. So he doesn't have a lot of room to drop before you would start predicting big Democratic gains in the midterm elections.
I would note that the economy that Donald Trump inherited, he may say that it was miserable under Joe Biden, but the economy was in pretty good shape 4 months ago. Growing employment, growing output, inflation had come down a great deal. So I'm sure that President Trump will continue to declare victory. But as Matt says, I think that those declarations of victory may fall increasingly on deaf ears in the public if the actual economic news continues to deteriorate, and we'll see whether it does.
Although we are getting a bit of a test of whether voters were mad about inflation just for sort of political reasons. And the answer seems to be no. That is, Donald Trump's numbers on inflation, approval on inflation, are at the same level that Biden's were already. So people are still unhappy with prices, whether that's because they're comparing them to a longer time ago or because Trump said that he would lower them and hasn't been able to. Voters were very unhappy with inflation under Biden the whole time, even as it came down, and now they're already very unhappy with inflation under Donald Trump.
Okay, so that's the economy. The other big issue the president ran on was immigration. And of course, he is touting the lowest number of crossings at the southern border in, I don't know, 20 years, I think he said, even though those crossings were down before he took office. But he's beginning to lose a few court cases. Matt, what are the political implications moving forward, and how do you see these court cases impacting policy?
Well, not just a few. He's lost essentially every substantive court ruling on immigration. The only times that he's won is when the concerns were about standing or venue. And so they have taken a lot of actions that they knew would be immediately challenged, and that might be part of the reason for it. Get as many of these folks detained or out of the country as you can before you start getting the pushback. Now they're under a lot more restraints than they were at the beginning of the administration. This is also another case where public opinion moves against the direction of policy, even though policymakers would like to be credited for their successes. Instead, it's more often the opposite. That is, Biden did reverse many of Trump's policies that voters at the time were alarmed about too much restrictiveness. But in response to that, voters actually moved very against immigration under the Biden administration. And now this went in as Trump's best issue, but voters are already moving him against him on immigration because we have these highly visible cases where there's concerns about due process, about the prison in El Salvador, and just about the crackdown in general. So even when voters seem to be asking for something, once they get it in the overshooting action that we usually find, they react against it.
Matt, would you say that you think that a lot of the electorate is between the extremes of Trump and Biden? Trump perceived as pursuing policies that are sometimes cruel and often in contravention of due process. And Biden, at least for the first 3 years of administration, opening the floodgates and allowing on very large amounts of immigration. There's a lot of room between those two extremes.
There are, and yes, the public, as in most issues, is between the positions of the Democratic and Republican Party elites, and that's one reason why they tend to react against the overshooting by each side. As you know, one issue for Trump here is that Biden had already substantially reversed policy on immigration, and by last summer was essentially at the level that was consistent with public opinion. So there wasn't a lot further that Trump could move, but he's doing so anyway, causing the public to shoot back in the other direction.
So, Matt, National Democrats from the beginning of the administration have seemed adrift in terms of strategy. But one of the things that they have continued to note is that we're going to take them to court. We're going to take them to court. So do the victories that they've seen or the defeats of the Trump administration in the courts, does that prove the strategy? It just takes a while to show its impact?
Well, people are still mad at Democrats in Congress for not achieving much or standing up to actions that the public is against that Trump is doing. I'm not sure the courts will help their particular standing, even as Republican support for Republicans in Congress is declining. People's opinions of Democrats in Congress is also declining and doesn't seem to have recovered. So I don't necessarily think that will get them out of it. That said, as a strategy for stopping or restricting actions in the Trump administration, certainly the courts have been far more effective than Congress so far. And yeah, Chuck Schumer's strategy of keeping the spotlight on Trump and not taking any of the blame for a government shutdown, maybe is looking better in retrospect, although it was still amazing that they got absolutely nothing out of a bipartisan a bill that they allowed to become law that didn't have any Democratic input.
And now moving forward into the spring, late spring here, we have congressional Republicans working on their budget and tax proposal. How do you see that coming to pass? Are they going to be able to hold their very conservative wing, especially in the House, on deficit and debt issues?
It's going to be difficult. As you know, people like to get rid of spending when it can be classified as waste, fraud, and abuse. But once it's 10 million fewer people on Medicaid, then it starts to bite. And there isn't a way to get low taxes, high spending, and a balanced budget. So that's when the actual decisions have to be made that tend to get reflected in media coverage and in local impact. And members of Congress are already hearing about that and will soon more. The other aspect of this is that a lot of this is going to be pushed to the states where they'll say, well, we're not cutting Medicaid. We want you to cut Medicaid. And that's going to mean that lots of state officials, especially in Republican states where they expanded Medicaid or even rely on Medicaid to provide nursing home care as well as health support for large parts of the population, they're going to end up being hit harder and they're going to not stay silent about it.
I'd like the listeners to to pay close attention to what Matt just said, because this is the triumph of arithmetic. I believe this is close to a quote, Matt. It's very difficult to have low taxes, high spending, and a balanced budget. I'm going to quote you on that on a regular basis.
Well, I think that gets back to Matt's comment about where the public stands on even immigration. One day they're here, one day they're there. I've got some pretty famous Bloom County comic strips on my wall that, depict someone screaming about the federal deficit and the budget. And then the next frame is, here's your Social Security check, here's your unemployment check, and all of that. So with that said, I'd like to turn to Dr. Miller for something that is front and center, especially here in Michigan, not just across the country. That is the tariff/trade war. As I noted, Dr. Miller is a professor of supply chain management here at Michigan State University, an expert on supply chains. He has special emphasis on the disruptive role of imports and tariffs. And Dr. Miller, you were recently quoted as saying that the United States will not win a trade war with China. Can you give us your perspective on this, please?
Yeah, and so a lot of this is based on, my general sense of, where how the US consumer behaves. And the US consumer does not like to not have goods available. And when you look at our dependency on China for certain categories of goods that you find around your house, the answers were almost completely dependent on them. You walk into your kitchen, you look at your blender, you look at your coffee pot, you look at your microwave, you look at your, insert whatever appliance. It probably came from China. If you've got young kids, your baby stroller, almost assuredly from China. Your car seats, almost assuredly from China. These are goods right now that are being tariffed 145%, which means that the retail price that consumers are going to pay is going to increase at minimum 50%. More realistically, you're looking at maybe 75%, if not more. Those cut into the budget of Americans. The variety on the shelves is going to fall substantially, certainly by July, if we maintain the current course. The US consumer will get very upset. China also has a near monopoly on the processing of what are called heavy rare earth metals, which are essential for ultra powerful magnets that you need in aerospace, you need in motor vehicles, you need in robotics. And they have embargoed essentially shipments of those to the United States right now. We don't know how much inventory we have. Of those magnets, but it's not that much because this trade conflict essentially was launched so suddenly that US importers didn't even know that they needed to stockpile items like that. And so my general sense when you look at the big macro scheme of things, there's far too much emphasis on the trade deficit and the idea that, well, the US buys more from China than they buy from us, therefore we have the power. Doesn't necessarily work that way, especially if a lot of the stuff they buy from us, they do have alternatives. So, for example, they'll source soybeans from Argentina and especially Brazil. And at the big scheme of things, we're not that large a share of China's GDP. China's by far the largest exporter, and it's a completely different political system. And more than anything, by our unilateral actions, we have substantially hurt our foreign relations with many of our closest allies. And you've already seen China going out to the other countries in South Asia saying, hey, we're the stable force right now. And for those of you with a sense of history, the very fact that China, South Korea, and Japan are even contemplating talking about a free trade agreement is something that is essentially politically stunning to think about. And so my general sense is that the US consumer, if back to school is very difficult to shop, and certainly if Christmas gets ruined, because it's important to understand that importers of Christmas items, over 85% of which come from China, same with toys. If those retailers and wholesalers don't place orders within the next month, they're not getting stuff here for the holidays. And at 145% tariff, I promise you they're bringing in far fewer items and far less variety than the consumer is used to.
Well, of course, the issue of supply chain is well in front of the mind of the American consumer, as it was something that was discussed widely and we became aware of during COVID. And so it's coming up again, the supply chain issue. Appreciate your perspective. I want to touch on something, ask about something you mentioned, because it's popped into my thought as well. You mentioned China, Japan, South Korea, possibly talking about a free trade agreement. I mean, my thought is that long term, the United States is going to become isolated in terms of economics, whether it's Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, or Southeast Asian and Asian countries. If these folks get wise, they'll understand that they have bigger GDP together than we do, and can really work to isolate us.
No, and we've actually had there's a published study that came out in 2024 that looked at the 2018-2019 trade war between the US and China. And one of their central conclusions was that as they framed it, the bystander countries, so really everybody else that isn't the US and China, they started to trade more with each other. That was the biggest outcome of that conflict. You remember during that time period as well, we had put some tariffs on steel and aluminum products from the world and things of that sort. But those tariffs were far less extensive even than the steel and aluminum tariffs that are in place today. Are the ones that were put in place in 2025 covered about 3 times the amount of goods on a value basis as the ones from 2018. And so, yes, the natural result is folks are going to look to diversify where they're selling. You already are seeing this with Canada talking about expanding pipeline capacity to the west. That way they could export more heavy crude oil to Asia. Guess what country that heavy crude oil is going to go to? We've said that name a lot the last couple minutes. Mexico's looking at diversifying as well. And possibly the biggest concern from a geopolitical standpoint is you have the EU having more interest in further discussion with China. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a big gap between the EU and China on numerous issues, electric vehicles being one of the biggest ones, with the Europeans wanting to protect their own auto sector. But certainly, we have not done ourselves any favors by essentially trying to fight a trade conflict with the world. And one thing that's very important to understand is, in general, there's been minimal retaliation against the United States just yet. Certainly, China has extensively retaliated, but pretty much nobody else has really retaliated. They're waiting for July to see what happens with the reciprocal tariff pause. But it's important for folks to understand that roughly one out of every $6 of goods manufactured in the United States is exported. And so you start to think what the ramifications are, for example, if the EU places massive retaliatory tariffs against US foods and beverages and construction equipment and farm equipment and things of that sort, that ripples down into our economy because it means less domestic production that then cascades further upstream and it affects factories in Michigan, the Great Lakes, and around the country.
Well, the theme of the 1964 World's Fair comes to mind. It's a small world after all, is it not? Charlie, any thoughts on impacts on the Michigan economy if this continues to proceed?
Well, we have already seen, our closest neighbor and biggest trading partner in Michigan, more than much of the rest of the country, is Canada, of course. And I think it's fair to say that President Trump's actions have really angered almost everybody in Canada.
Well, it
President
swayed an
Trump,
election. Look what happened
yeah,
this week. It swayed an election.
President Trump handed an election to the Liberal Party in Canada, which when Trump took office, they were behind by 25 or 30 percentage points. Fewer Canadians are traveling to the United States. Fewer Canadians are looking at the labels on stuff and not buying stuff that's from the U.S. And so that can't be good for Michigan. And I think it can't be good for the rest of the country. I want to mention one thing. The big question in my mind is whether, and if so, when President Trump will back down. He has vacillated on some aspects, not all, but he's vacillated on some aspects of the tariffs. We saw another very interesting episode just in the last week or so. Trump issued some scathing remarks about the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, and indicated that he was getting ready to fire him. And when he did that, the stock market tanked. Well, when the stock market tanked in response to some of the tariff stuff, Trump backed down. When the stock market tanked in response to his remarks about Powell, Trump backed down and he said, no, I'm not going to fire him. So if we get to the point that Jason has said, it's hard for me to imagine that President Trump won't A, back down, and then B, tell what a brilliant job he's done. But we'll see. Maybe he wants to carry this through to the bitter end. But if he does, as Professor Miller has said, you won't be able to find a whole lot of stuff on the shelves in November, December.
And when American consumers cannot find a whole lot of stuff on the shelves, that's when it'll hit the fan. I don't think I have to stock up on my toilet paper or tissues or anything, but certainly those items, back to school, Christmas, and those items that we all buy for each other around that time of year. Matt, if the public sees empty store shelves or prices that jump 25, 50, 75%, that's not going to bode very well for the president, and he'll have by the fall, I don't think he'll have anybody but himself to blame for this.
Well, interestingly, the usual political trade effects are due to employment changes rather than effects on consumers. So it will be interesting to see how big of an effect it has here. I wanted to ask Jason maybe to do a little bit more comparison with the previous Trump tariffs, because as you know, we're able to study those tariffs, and although they were a lot smaller, the retaliatory tariffs from China were very well targeted to try to hurt Trump politically. There was an immediate political effect from even the announcement of the tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs against Trump. These are much bigger, so one prediction might be, well, the effects would all be much bigger, but Trump is sort of touting it more as a warlike posture against against China, and trying to get more of a rallying phenomenon like you sometimes see with sanctions. So what do you think? Does bigger tariffs just mean bigger problems for the president here, especially in how other countries will respond, or might we get to a kind of a warlike posture here?
So I think the biggest difference with, this round of tariffs is how much consumer goods were affected. So previously in 2018 and 2019, the vast majority of kind of these key consumer products that we think about, smartphones, laptops, baby strollers, things like that, those were not covered whatsoever by the tariffs. So the tariffs with China were very much aimed at what we call intermediate inputs. So goods that manufacturers in the US use as an input to produce a product and then, ship that out. This time we're hitting a lot of these consumer goods. So that really changes, I think, the dynamic of how the consumer is likely to see an effect. Right now, part of the challenge is with this reciprocal tariff pause, we just don't know what's coming in July. We're hearing discussions about, there's going to be all of these trade deals. Well, remember, Congress has to approve a trade deal. So the president can't just magically sign these things. This does have to go through Congress if it's a formal trade agreement. But my sense is that a lot of what we'll negotiate it'll be basically USMCA 2.0, and that the USMCA was effectively NAFTA 2.0. Very, very, very little changed, but it was touted as this massive marketing success. And so we may see some things of this sort. But really, we're not going to know, I'd say, the broader implications until July. Certainly, the worst case scenario for Americans is it comes July. We don't have anything with the EU. The 20% tariffs go back into play. The EU fully retaliates against the United States. And just as was mentioned, the retaliation is going to be asymmetrical. It's not like the Europeans are going to place a 20% tariff on everything from the US. They will wreck the US brewing industry, but especially the whiskey industry. So you may see 50 or 100% tariffs on, let's say, Jack Daniels. You'll see tariffs that hit, the egg sector. And then especially the rest of the world will go after the Magnificent Seven. So there will be targeted retaliation against the US tech companies because they're so critical to our economy. Back in 2019, we had to bail the farmers out. We had to hand farmers about $23 billion because China didn't buy soybeans. China's effectively canceled most ag orders from the US right now. And we exported in 2024, 52% of our soybean exports went to China. So you take out half of our market for soybeans, there's no way the rest of the world picks that up necessarily. And so that is not good for farmers. So we're going to be doing bailouts again as well. So, the reality is that we've had tariffs argued to do serve sort of four purposes, and the problem is you can't do all four of these at the same time. One is negotiating leverage. That's fine, but that means that they're not long term, which then means the following three things don't happen. You don't see a massive resurgence of manufacturing employment when that's not going to happen anyway. I hate to break it to folks, but that's just not happening because of tariffs. There's no evidence in history that this actually takes place. If anything, the opposite occurs, that tariffs cost you manufacturing jobs. If you tariffs are for negotiation, they're not a stable source of revenue. I do expect 10% baseline tariff is basically here to stay regardless. The president's just obsessed with tariff revenue. But then the last one is balancing the trade deficit. For most of the countries, take a Vietnam as an example, we're never going to have a balanced trade deficit, nor do we even worry about that. The good example of this, one famous economist always said that he ran a trade deficit with his barber. Anybody listening who's got students to Michigan, going to Michigan State, you're running a trade deficit with us. That is how it works. Um, and so we're not going to accomplish all these goals. No one thinks the U.S. is going to start running a trade surplus with a lot of these countries anytime soon because Laos does not need to buy that many things from the U.S., but we like to buy textiles from them.
I want to thank you very much, Dr. Miller. Very, very insightful, very, very informative. And I suspect that over the coming weeks and months, we'll be talking again. I expect to see some soybean burgers on my shelf by the fall as we look for different ways to use our products. But thank you again, Charlie, Matt. Any final words as we enter the summer?
Well, there hasn't been a whole lot of really fun news on this podcast, but I will tell you that the Tigers are in first place and the daffodils and tulips are looking good. So there's a lot of good things going on, even if the economy is in rough shape.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Matt?
Bumpy roads ahead, but so much news we didn't even get to the governor standing with Trump again to open the Air Force base.
Was it a hug or a lean in, Matt?
The only the only Democratic governor leaning into her relationship with Trump. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes.
Yes, well, I'm sure that will be on our plate in the coming weeks as well. Well, thank you all again. Greatly appreciate Russ White and the staff here at MSU Radio Studios for their support of this program. Join us again next month on State of the State.